So, the first Great Train Robbery didn't actually involve stealing a train, and the 60s reboot only involved stealing a train so they could move it into a siding to get the money it was carrying. But has anyone ever hijacked or stolen a train, not for the contents of the carriages, but just so they could drive it? Well, funnily enough, yes. The theft of a steam locomotive happened in the events of the 1953 film The Titfield Thunderbolt. The characters of Old Dan and Mr. Valentine, played by Hugh Griffith and the Stanley Holloway respectively, stole a Great Western 1400 class tank engine after theirs was sabotaged by a rival bus company. The two took it for a joyride off the rails before crashing it into a tree and getting arrested for numerous offences. Now obviously the film is a work of fiction, but it must have sparked the minds of two men who decided in January of 1961 to try their luck and recreate that fateful scene. This is the story from what I can gather. I might not have all the details correct, but it's as close as I can get them, so do bear with me. At around midnight, engine number 6422, a Great Western pannier tank, departed from the sheds and stopped at the signal box on the outlet line of the Stafford Road Yards in Wolverhampton. The driver gave the signalman the number of the engine and informed them that he was to take the locomotive light engine to Worcester for maintenance. The signalman informed the driver he was to couple onto the night sleeper train that was readying to depart and go with it as far as Wolverhampton low-level station. The driver agreed and shunted the engine to the back of the passenger train. Once the train reached low-level station, 6422 was uncoupled and continued down the line. It's believed that the engine stopped at Sowerbridge to take on water as it was making the run. At around 2 AM, the engine approached a signal box that ordered it to move into a siding to allow a faster freight train to overtake them. The signalman reported the timing of the freight train to Control as normal before mentioning he was holding a light engine in the siding. Control reported no knowledge of the engine or why it was so far down the main line, so they requested the signalman ask the driver what he was doing. By this point, the engine had been stopped for 30 minutes, and when the signalman came out to talk to the driver, he found that both the driver and the fireman had gone. As it turned out, both men had been wanted all day by railway police, I believe for committing a robbery. They had likely seen engine 6422 parked in a siding and decided to make an escape using a very unorthodox method of transport. But not only did they steal the engine, they also expertly navigated it through the yard and across many points and switches without incident. Hell, they told a yard official where they were going and even coupled the engine to a passenger train without raising suspicion. They managed to fire the engine correctly, refill it with water halfway, and managed to fool numerous railway officials without raising suspicion. They literally stole a steam engine because they could. The men were eventually caught, and it was found the driver was, or at one point was, a soldier. It's believed he also had much experience driving a locomotive and was familiar with the line he drove it down, as there were hundreds of signals and many ground discs along the way that informed him if the points and signals were set correctly, something that many amateurs would miss or interpret incorrectly. By the time the men had come to the end of their joyride, they'd made it 28 miles away from Wolverhampton. The driver and fireman were both tried in court. When asked about the charges, an official said, "There is trespass, of course, and there must be something which stops people from taking away rolling stock without permission." Suffice to say, both of them either got some prison time or a stern slap on the wrists. The story still goes around today, partly as a reminder of how important it is to be secure with such things, but mostly because it's just bloody hilarious. With everything going on with crypto bros, NFTs, and stocks as stable as a knitted jumper made out of snakes, I feel now would be a good time to talk about how a railroad built a locomotive entirely to scam investors. In 1887, the Holman Locomotive Company was approached with a bizarre idea for a steam engine. Rather than simply deciding to turn down the idea, they decided to turn what was an awful invention into a genius marketing scheme. The engine they built came to be known as the Holman locomotive. All it was really is a traditional 440 locomotive balanced on top of some smaller wheels, making it a 612-0, not counting the wheels that aren't touching the rails. Nobody really knew what benefits this had, but the intended idea was to speed up the engine. Any engineer or mechanic worth their salt knew this was a stupid idea, and so did the Holman Locomotive Company. Not only was the engine more likely to tip over on tight curves, but the chances of the wheels slipping increased dramatically too. So if it was a terrible idea, why did they build it? Simply put, Publicity. The engine ran in New Jersey with adverts claiming it to be the design of the future and that many future locomotives would be designed in this way to increase performance. In reality, this was nothing more than a stock market scam, with newspapers in Philadelphia claiming a company had been formed to sell these engines with a capital stock of $10 million, offering to sell the stock for $25 a share with the par value being $100. Soon, investors tangled in the excitement flocked to buy shares for this groundbreaking design that would be the future of railroading, obviously having little to no understanding of basic engineering. The locomotive itself ran for a few months before being withdrawn, likely being removed from its awkward plinth and converted back into a 440. Strangely enough though, another one was built 10 years later by Baldwin in 1897 for the Holman Locomotive Speeding Truck Company. It's unclear as to why it was built, but the most common belief is that it was an attempt on Baldwin's behalf to pull the same scam. The moral of the story here, I suppose, is just because something looks good on paper doesn't mean it will work in practice. But if you can spend a little money on advertising, tangle people up with the hype, and can get some suckers with more money than sense to buy your idea, then you don't have to worry about looking like the idiot. In 1970, a gentleman by the name of Charles Osmond Frederick was employed by British Rail as an engineer specialising in interaction between rails and wheels. Part of Frederick's job was coming up with ideas and designs to help improve locomotives and rolling stock on the railway network. Like many other inventive and creative minds, however, Frederick also had some unique ideas, and all the attention that had come out of the space race at the time must have given him some inspiration. One day, Frederick started drawing up plans for a lifting platform. However, for some reason, he just didn't stop designing it. What was meant to be a simple lifting platform became more and more complex, adding more things on and making it bigger until he had eventually designed a flying saucer, a vehicle capable of interplanetary travel utilizing a fusion reactor and laser beams to fly across the stars. When he had finished the design, he turned it in. Rather remarkably, instead of calling him a loony and going about their day, British Rail took the design to the patent office and requested that it be patented. 3 years later, in 1973, all the paperwork was filled and British Rail officially had the legal right to use Frederick's spaceship. Given the space race and the rapid advance of technology, some people speculated that BR was getting a foot in the door early by designing and patenting spacecraft. Others believed that with the increase in air travel, BR thought railways would soon become obsolete and that flying vehicles would be the future. Plans were genuinely considered for heliports to be set on the roofs of some railway stations, which gave this theory some ground. Many other interesting theories have developed as to the reason for British Railways patenting a spaceship. However, the real reason behind it is a bit anticlimactic, but still equally as silly. You see, British Rail had a policy wherein any invention designed by a member of their offices had to be patented, regardless of what it was. Because Frederick had properly drawn and developed the design, it had to be patented, despite the fact it had nothing to do with railways, the technology depicted in the design didn't exist yet, and the fact that even if it did, the passengers aboard would have been blasted with devastating amounts of radiation. Anyone with even the slightest degree of engineering knowledge knew the design was stupid. But the simple policy of all inventions needing to be patented meant a whole bunch of office workers had to go out of their way to verify the originality of the UFO and secure the rights so that nobody but BR could build it. Naturally, British Rail didn't pursue further development of the design. People moved on from the space race, and railways weren't entirely replaced with air travel. Naturally, BR chose not to pay the renewal fee for the patent in 1976, and as such they no longer had a hold on it. Because of this, anyone in the UK can now build their own version of the British Railways flying saucer. Let this story be another example of the quirks of bureaucracy, a simple rule needing to be followed resulting in something silly being taken seriously. But above all that, the British Rail flying saucer tells us that even while stuck drawing up blueprints in a stuffy old office, people are still happily daydreaming about sailing amongst the stars. In 1923, the Great Western Railway absorbed Cambrian Railways and needed some new locomotives for passenger work on their lines. The issue was that the Cambrian lines had a very light loading gauge, meaning the locomotives that ran on the lines couldn't be too heavy, else risk damaging the rails and infrastructure. As such, the GWR decided to continue using their Juke class of locomotives, as they were light enough to run on the line and strong enough to keep up with the traffic. By 1929, however, most of the Jukes servicing the line were past their working lives and in need of replacement, with their frames in particular being their most fatigued part. At the same time, the heavier Bulldog class of engines were also being withdrawn, having been made redundant by newer engines. With a surplus of Bulldogs now lined up to be scrapped and the old Dukes in need of stronger frames, the GWR decided to experiment by taking the top half of a Duke and fitting it to the frames of a Bulldog. The resulting engine was still about as light as a Duke, meaning it was safe to run on the Cambrian line, but now having stronger and more durable frames to improve their reliability and working lifespan. With the experiment being deemed a success, it was decided in 1936 that another 29 of these hybrid engines were to be put together using the old Bulldog frames and the now very worn out Duke's cabs and boilers. As you can probably guess, the GWR had a habit of assigning names to their various classes of locomotives, with some examples being cities, counties, saints, and of course, Dukes. Around the time these rebuilt engines were put together, the posh and aristocratic directors of the Great Western Railway wanted a class of locomotives to be named after them. For money reasons, it was better to label the engines as new despite being made up of bits of old locomotive, and as such, the company's chief engineer at the time, Charles Collett, saw an opportunity for a laugh at the expense of the directors. These new engines were very old-fashioned and Victorian in appearance, so Collett decided that these engines were to bear the names of the company's directors. Keep in mind, Nigel Gresley's A4 Express engines had started working roughly a year prior to this, and so when the supposedly brand new Earl class of locomotives was unveiled at Paddington Station, the directors, who were expecting something modern and flashy, were not amused that their names were going to be on the sides of locomotives that appeared to be 40 years out of date. To really rub it in, the locomotives were rarely called Earls by railway workers or frequent passengers, but instead earned the nickname of Juke Dogs because they were made up of old Duke and Bulldog locomotives. Despite their old-fashioned design and aristocratically annoying names, they managed to work the Cambrian lines until 1960, serving as a reminder to those same directors that you should always be careful what you wish for. By 1915, the First World War was really beginning to heat up. More and more countries were becoming tangled up in the bloodshed, and it wouldn't be long before the entire globe would be at each other's throats. Many Europeans who'd moved abroad desperately wanted to fight for their countries, or help turn the tide in their favour by committing acts of espionage. However, as it turned out, not everyone who wanted to help was quite cut out to be a spy. After Britain joined the war in 1914, many other countries that were part of the British Empire also ended up joining shortly after and aiding in the front lines. When Japan also joined the war shortly after as an ally of Britain, Germany began to get concerned. As Canada was part of the British Empire, not only could they send their own troops and supplies, but also help transport Japanese troops from the Pacific across Canada, where they could join Canadian troops on their way to the Western Front. Germany was convinced this was going to happen, and as such ordered the Canadian railway system be disrupted. This order was answered by Mr. Werner Horn, a German Army Reserve lieutenant who'd been managing a coffee plantation in Guatemala. He had tried to return to Germany at the outbreak of the war, but ended up stuck in New York due to the British blockade of the North Sea. As his old plantation had found a new manager, he found work at another plantation in Chiapas before getting a card officially ordering him to return to Germany in December. On his way back, he met Franz von Papen in New York, the military attaché of the German embassy in Washington. Papen had formulated a plan to sabotage the St. Croix-Vanceboro railway bridge that crossed the border between Canada and the US, and was looking for willing volunteers to do it. The US was strictly neutral during the outbreak of the war, having forbid Canada from transporting troops or wartime supplies through US soil. The Canadian Pacific was still allowed to use their line travelling through Maine. Despite using it to carry troops and supplies, because they weren't being loaded or unloaded on US soil, the US simply turned a blind eye. Many in Germany objected to this practice, but the complaints seemed to fall on deaf ears. Papen buttered up Horn by telling him destroying the bridge would be viewed as an act of valor in Germany, and that he'd be a hero for disrupting enemy supply lines while not having to kill anyone. On top of this, despite being a major supply route, the bridge was unguarded as nobody expected a little nowhere town in Maine to be a significant military target. Horn was sold, and so Papen paid him $700 to destroy the bridge. Horn had never received any official kind of training to be a spy, but figured how hard could it be? And in late January of 1915, he put the plan into action. He acquired a load of dynamite, which he packed into a suitcase and hopped aboard an overnight train to Boston, which continued to Maine. I would like to stress that not only was he carrying dynamite on a passenger train, but he also slept with it in his bed compartment on the trip. When he arrived in Vanceboro, he checked into a nearby hotel and got straight to work, and immediately raised suspicion when he was spotted hiding the suitcase in a pile of wood before scouting out the bridge. After 3 Vanceboro residents reported him for suspicious behaviour, he was questioned by a US immigration inspector. Horn informed the inspector he was merely a Danish farmer looking to buy land in the area, and spent the next 2 days laying low and keeping a note of the Canadian Pacific schedule. Once he had all the information he needed, he was ready to do the deed. Late at night on the 1st of February 1915, he checked out of his hotel saying he needed to catch a train, and set off for the bridge. He changed into a German army uniform to prevent himself from being labelled as a spy in the event he got caught, an offence he could be executed for. As prepared as he was to pull off the bombing, what he wasn't prepared for was the weather. Not only was it extremely cold that night, with temperatures as low as -34 degrees Celsius, but extremely windy too. He reached the bridge around midnight and got ready to set the explosives in place, only to be interrupted by a train thundering past. He waited for a moment for it to be all clear before continuing to work on the explosives, only to be interrupted again by yet another train. Horn, despite being an enemy spy willing to fight for the fatherland, armed with roughly 60 pounds of dynamite and about to destroy enemy infrastructure, really didn't want to hurt anyone with this explosion. As such, he waited a while in the freezing gale to make sure no more trains were coming before continuing. It was 7 minutes past 1 in the morning by the time he had placed the bomb. He cut the fuse and lit it with a cigar before hurrying away to the same hotel he had checked out of earlier. The hotel proprietor saw how badly frostbitten Horn was and allowed him to check back in for the night. Because the Horn had cut the fuse, the dynamite exploded after only 3 minutes at 10 past 1, blowing out windows across Vanceboro and St. Croix, exposing many residents to the cold, harsh winds outside. The blast was so powerful it left the bridge relatively intact. Only a few iron beams were twisted out of shape, and upon inspection the next day, the damage to the bridge was found to be relatively minor. Frankly, the bomb seemed to have caused more damage to its surroundings than to its target. It didn't take long for the hotel proprietor to connect the explosion with Horn reappearing in the middle of the night half frozen. The sheriff of Vanceboro and 2 Canadian police officers detained Horn at the hotel, Horn having changed into his uniform again to prevent spy charges. As he was arrested on US soil, he was tried by the US courts first, where he signed a confession. Because the explosion happened on the Canadian side of the bridge, the most the court could charge him with was carrying explosives on a public train. He was sentenced to 18 months in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in Georgia. Afterwards, he was extradited to Canada in 1919, where he was tried for attempting to blow up the bridge. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but was released and sent back to Germany in 1921 after being deemed insane. In reality, he was suffering from syphilis. What happened to him afterwards isn't really known. The bridge, meanwhile, was only out of service for a few days before it was quickly repaired. Not only was Horn's attempt to serve the fatherland a fantastic demonstration of how not to be a spy, but in the long term led to the US cracking down on possible German spies. The fact von Papen, an official German ambassador, managed to orchestrate this attack showed the US that despite being neutral, they still weren't safe, or worse, were inadvertently helping German spies orchestrate attacks on Canada. Eventually, the US started sending supplies to the Allied countries, and finally finally joined the war in 1917. Looking back, Werner Horn's attempt to blow up the Vansborough Bridge is frankly a comical example that not everybody is cut out to be a spy. From carrying explosives in public to getting caught several times acting suspiciously to failing to achieve his goal in the first place, it'd be fair to say he wasn't exactly the best the fatherland had to offer in terms of espionage ability. So remember, if you're ever offered the chance to get in on some secretive spying skullduggery, maybe think twice before playing James Bond, as you may end up acting a bit more Austin Powers. Runaway trains are rare. Over the years of rail transportation, there have been very few full-on runaway train incidents compared to issues such as derailments, crashes, or collisions. Nonetheless, they can still be dangerous if not dealt with quickly. That's why there are so many precautions in place to prevent them from happening. These, however, still aren't enough, as Human Error pointed out in 2001. By most modern standards, a runaway train is close to impossible to set in motion. Most locomotives have 3 sets of brakes as well as air brakes fitted to most good wagons, carriages and rolling stock. On top of this, most diesels have what is known as a dead man switch, a pedal that the driver must hold down with their foot at all times while the engine is in motion. This way, should they pass out or be away from the controls while the engine is in motion, the pedal will lift up and cut the engine's power. Numerous other checks are in place too, such as passing loops to allow runaway trains to either be derailed or to allow other trains on the line to pass by, but few of these things were much help on the 15th of May 2001. On this day, an unnamed driver was using engine number 8888 to shunt a load of freight wagons around the yard of Walbridge, Ohio. The engine was hauling 25 empty wagons and 22 loaded ones when it approached a misaligned switch. The driver saw the switch, and despite how slow the train was going, he knew he couldn't stop short of it. The driver decided to slow down the train enough so that he could jump out, correct the switch, and jump back in before going down the wrong track. This is where it all went wrong. There were 3 different sets of brakes on this particular kind of locomotive. The first is the air brake. This applies the brakes on all the wagons connected to a train, essentially making it more of an emergency stop. This, however, was not connected to the wagons as they were being shunted, so only the engine's air brakes came on. Setting the air brake also disables the dead man switch. As to why, I am uncertain. The second brake is a standard type of block brake on each of the engine's wheels. These simply press a piece of metal against the wheels to apply friction to slow it down. They're simple, but aren't as effective at stopping a train as the other 2. The final kind of brake is a dynamic brake. To simplify, these essentially change the motors that power the wheels into dynamos that generate electricity, essentially removing energy from the wheels, which brings them to a stop. The throttle system is used to determine how strong the resistance of the dynamos is, and subsequently how strong the braking power is. In other words, full throttle with dynamic brakes on means the dynamos are on full stopping power. On this occasion, the driver applied the block brakes and went through the process of turning on the air brakes and dynamic brakes. Only he didn't set the dynamic brakes correctly, so when he cranked the throttle to full power, he thought it was applying maximum braking power when he was actually setting the locomotive to full speed ahead. The weight of the train meant that it would accelerate too slow for him to notice when he jumped off to set the points. By the time he had corrected them and turned to board his locomotive, he found it going much faster than he expected. He tried to board it but was dragged 80 feet along the ground before letting go. The train was now heading out of the yard and south, deeper into the state of Ohio. What made this runaway train more of an issue was the 2 tankers of molten phenol it was carrying. Phenol being a very toxic ingredient used in the making of glue, paint and dyes. Yard managers, signal operators and the police were soon made aware of the runaway train. Luckily, its acceleration was hindered by the block brakes that were applied, though the brakes would only keep its speed in check for a short amount of time until they were worn away to the point of uselessness. Several people tried to run alongside and board the locomotive with little success. At a passing loop, it was diverted into a siding with a derailleur placed on the track in an attempt to stop it, only for the force of the train to throw it clear of the track and continue thundering down the line. The local police were informed of a red emergency fuel cutoff button located on the side of the engine just under the running board. Because of the engine's speed, it was impossible to run alongside it to press the button, so naturally the police decided to handle it by doing what they do best. They waited by the tracks and fired a shotgun at the button from besides the line as it passed. Not only did the police mistakenly shoot 3 times at the big red fuel filler cap instead of the button, but the button needed to be held down for several seconds for it to cut the fuel, so shooting it would have done nothing anyway. Eventually, a northbound freight train had to be put in a siding to allow the runaway to safely pass it. It was decided that the engine pulling the train was to uncouple and give chase to the runaway. Eventually, it caught up to the rear of the train and they were coupled together, allowing the chasing engine to apply its brakes and slow the runaway enough for someone ahead to climb aboard and stop it. Upon inspection, the brake blocks of engine 8888 were completely destroyed from the heat caused by the friction from braking. The name of the driver responsible for the runaway was never revealed, nor was the disciplinary action taken against him by the company. Engine 8888 was repaired and put back into service, having earned the nickname of Crazy 8 by workers and enthusiasts of the railroad. Many people offered to buy the engine after seeing the story on the news, but CSX never bothered, claiming the engine was not worthy of preservation, likely not wanting a museum or enthusiast to keep it as a reminder of the story and giving them some bad publicity. In 2015, the engine was modified and rebuilt, being given the new number of 4389, with CSX likely wanting everyone to forget about the incident. The story was eventually forgotten in the minds of the general public, but did serve as inspiration for the film Unstoppable. You can put all the safety stops you want in place, but no matter what you do, no computer or machine will ever be able to account for human error, no matter how advanced. So the moral of the story? Just try and be careful, because even the most up-to-date safety features aren't always guaranteed to stop a locomotive from doing an Ozzy Osbourne. Railways have served many purposes throughout the years, from transportation of minerals to transporting people. There was, however, one railway that served a very different and unique purpose, not to transport or move materials en masse, but rather to exploit a loophole in specific maritime laws so a company could deliver fish. In 1920, after evaluating the effect naval blockades from the First World War had on shipping, the United States put laws in place to ensure that any goods being shipped between US ports would be exclusively done by US ships. The Jones Act, as it is known, requires that any ship transporting goods or people from one US port to another must have been built in the US out of at least 90% US steel, be owned by a US citizen, at least 70% of the crew be US citizens, and it must fly the US flag. This way, companies can't outsource transportation work to cheap foreign ships, and ensures that things being shipped from one US port to another is done exclusively by US ships and follows all the rules and guidelines set in place by the Act. Some northern shipping companies tried to get around this by delivering to ports in Canada, and from there moving the supplies by land to its intended destination in the US. However, as the final destination of the cargo was still the US, the Act still applied, meaning that unless the ship carrying the cargo was US built and operated, the company would be hit with a hefty fine and a lot of legal trouble. This meant that if a company wanted to get around the Jones Act, they would have to get creative, which is exactly what the American Seafood Group did. In the 1980s, American Seafood began transporting fish from Dutch Harbor in Alaska to Maine via the Panama Canal. Because the ship would be traveling from one US port to another, the Jones Act would apply. However, a clause in the Jones Act, known as the Third Proviso, specified that if any part of the route travels along a Canadian railway line, then the shipment is exempt from the Act. As such, American Seafood was able to use cheaper foreign-flagged ships by unloading their fish in New Brunswick, Canada, and transporting them to Maine via the New Brunswick and Southern Railway. From there, the fish would be loaded into trucks and sent to their intended destination. While this loophole worked for many years, ideally when transporting cargo, especially something that can spoil such as raw fish, you want to make as few stops as possible to decrease journey time. Having to pay the railroad to move the fish and spend time loading and unloading was a lot of trouble to save money on shipping. Ideally, American Seafood wanted to just load the fish straight into awaiting trucks, but unless the fish were transported via Canadian Railway at some point, they'd have to obey the Jones Act and pay all the additional costs that came with it. But then one day in 2012, someone at American Seafood had an awfully devious idea. They proposed that the ships unload the fish at Bayside Harbour in New Brunswick, a port that is literally less than 30 minutes drive away from the border to Maine. The fish would be loaded directly into the trucks that would take them to their intended destination in Maine via road. Before the trucks set off, however, they would be loaded onto a railway flatbed wagon and moved back and forth along a short section of track on the bay. This track would be legally classified as a railway and the journey would take less than a minute to complete. The truck would then be driven off the flatbed and could then drive the 26 kilometers into Maine, and from there deliver the fish. By doing this, the ship technically wouldn't have arrived at a US port, and the fish would have technically been transported by a Canadian railway, thereby meaning the Jones Act wouldn't apply to the shipment. Now, saying it out loud makes the whole scheme sound ridiculous and an obvious attempt to get around regulations, which is what makes the fact American Seafood actually put this plan into motion even more hilarious. The company built 70 meters of track in Bayside in 2012, purchased a shunting tractor and 2 flatbed wagons, dubbed it the Bayside Canadian Railway, and put the plan into action. As absurd as the whole idea was, it worked. The fish no longer fell under the Jones Act, they didn't have to pay the New Brunswick Railway anymore, and American Seafood was still able to hire cheaper foreign ships to make the deliveries as a result. Eventually, all great scams come to an end, and the Bayside Canadian Railway was no different. In 2021, the US Customs and Border Protection finally cracked down on American Seafood after discovering the railway they were shipping goods on was actually a tiny section of track connected to nothing, stating that the third proviso exemption they were using only applied to through routes, aka railways that actually went somewhere, and as such, the Bayside Railway didn't count and the Jones Act would still apply. The case was taken to federal court, with the company stating that it was a registered Canadian rail line, and that there was no legal minimum distance required for the goods to travel for the exemption to apply. The court allowed American Seafood to continue the practice while the case was ongoing. By 2022, a district court judge from Alaska ruled that the railway was non-compliant with the Jones Act, and the railway was finally closed down in 2023, though the fines against the company were waived. As I said, railways have been built for many reasons and to serve many different purposes over the years, but out of them all, I think we can all agree that none may be quite as unique or bizarre as the Bayside Canadian Railway. In a world where new railways are becoming more and more of a rarity, it's nice to know that railways still have their place in the modern world, even if it is just to exploit a niche maritime law so a company can save money on transporting fish, in a way that's as obvious as it is hilarious. Railways are no stranger to having assets stolen from them. Notable thefts include stealing gold and money from moving trains, but even things like rails and signalling equipment have been taken by criminals wanting to make a quick penny. Robbery of railway property still happens to this day, some thefts more egregious than others, but none may be more bizarre than the man who was tricked into stealing an entire railway station. Built in 1847 by the Yorkshire and Lancashire Railway, Cleckheaton Central Station stood as a hub for both passengers and goods for many years. It served the people of West Yorkshire about as well as any other station in the world, and had its own fair share of notable accidents, including a handful of runaway trucks derailing and smashing a butcher's shop. But aside from that, was pretty much like any other station in the country. It was absorbed into the LNWR, then the LMS, before finally becoming part of the British Railways system in 1948. By 1965, the station was closed to passengers as part of the beaching cuts, and by 1969 was closed completely. At this point, half of the station had been demolished, with only the platforms, main station building, and a few sections of track remaining. British Railways, likely busy organising the demolition and disposal of many other stations, left Cleckheaton in its partially standing state for another 2 years before finally getting round to organising a team to pull down the remaining structure. In 1971, a demolition company from Leeds was contracted to remove the rest of the station, with British Railways paying them £2,382 for the job and giving them permission to sell off the materials for profit. However, when they finally arrived at the site, they found the station they'd been contracted to remove was already gone. Both the demolition team and British Railways were baffled as to how a station could just vanish, and so an investigation was launched. A short while later, the culprit was found, a 33-year-old demolition contractor from Dewsbury by the name of Reginald Sedgwick. 24 tons of material had already been removed from the site, including stone, timber, metal, rails, sleepers, buffers, station benches, and more. And so Sedgwick was taken to court in 1972, charged with effectively stealing Cleckheaton's station. Sedgwick, however, denied that he had stolen the station, and claimed that he was in fact contracted to demolish it. He stated that he'd been contacted by a Mr. Watson on behalf of Northern Sites Development in Leeds, offering him £400 to knock down the station for British Railways and letting him sell off the materials for extra profit. With the materials of the station having a combined value of roughly £600, Sedgwick took on the job and paid Watson a £100 bond for the contract, spending an extra £200 hiring the equipment needed, and then over the course of the next 3 weeks, tearing down and selling off the station. Naturally, investigators tried to find this Mr. Watson and Northern Sites Development. However, it turned out that neither he nor the company existed, and rather conveniently, Sedgwick had lost the receipt for the bond he'd paid. After finding this out, the prosecution naturally believed that Sedgwick was telling a fat pack of lies and had made up Watson as a scapegoat, stating, quote, "What the case really comes to is that this man, last August, in effect, stole Cleckheaton Station." Sedgwick, however, stuck firmly to his story, admitting that he did demolish the station, but reaffirming that he was contracted to do so by this mysterious Mr. Watson. After 2 days in court, the jury eventually found Sedgwick not guilty of stealing Cleckheaton Station, and accepted that, quote, "he pulled the station down in good faith." Once the case was closed, Sedgwick said he'd continue searching for Mr. Watson, claiming he'd been conned and that, quote, "he owes the £100 bond I paid him and £400 for the job." Given that Sedgwick also paid £200 out of his own pocket to hire the equipment needed to demolish the station, I certainly hope he got his money back in the end. So, what's the lesson to take away from this? Read your contracts, double check to make sure your boss isn't a con man? I'm not entirely sure. What we can say for certain though is that, as terrible as people stealing from railways is, you have to admit, stealing an entire station without British Railways knowing is quite the achievement, and, if I do say, downright hilarious. Subscribe for more.